G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test. And in this one, we are continuing the Jack the Ripper suspect series, but with a bit of a twist. I'm going to tell you the story of Dr. Stanley, and then we'll see, does it pass the pub test? So let me tell you the story of Dr. Stanley. He was a well-respected and known cancer surgeon. Now, he wasn't the only high-profile doctor working in that particular field in London. And he had a very good job within the London hospital, or I should say a London hospital. Possibly the Whitechapel Hospital. Now, life for him was going very well, but then a very unfortunate event happened in his life that he had no control over. His son was out on a boat race or boat party, it really doesn't matter, but he falls under the charm of a particular lady. Now, she was not necessarily an unfortunate, but she did charge for her time. But she charged a premium. And because Dr. Stanley's son was no doubt well off, he could afford this particular person. But what he did not know is that she carried a communicable disease. And after a brief relationship, he comes down with that disease. Now, Dr. Stanley is beside himself. His son was the most important thing in his life. And to be taken away now, when his son would just be entering the prime of his life, he could not have. But he had at his disposal all the resources, all the best brains, and all of the research tools available to fight that disease. I mean, surely, considering he was fighting cancer, there must be a way of finding a cure for this communicable disease. But he fails. After a few years, his son passes away. He is now filled with grief. But that stage of grief then turns to rage. He is going to find that particular person, and he's going to make sure that they pay. So he sets about seeking revenge. Now he hits the streets, and he hears of this particular lady who was quite the high-end unfortunate. But now, because of the rumour that she had this disease, she was no longer a high-end unfortunate, but she dropped down the ranks to being one of those who would walk the streets of London seeking money to put a roof over her head. But amongst all these people, how would he find her? Well, this would mean going out on the streets, talking to these women, getting information, but obviously doing so discreetly. But on one evening in 1888, he comes across Polly Nichols. He has a chat to her and finds out that she knows many of the unfortunates. And it's possible that she might know of that particular person he's looking for, because she's lived in the area and knows of that particular person. But now Dr. Stanley has a problem. If something happens to that person, well, now Polly Nichols could identify him. So he goes along with the normal business transaction that Polly Nichols would be expecting. So going off the main street, she takes him to a dark, secluded spot in Bucks Row. Now, he's a bit of an older gentleman. He looks quite distinguished. And so Polly Nichols, with her guard down, didn't realise that he not only had the knowledge, but the ability to do away with her quickly, clinically, and cleanly. And perhaps, after he's finished his work there, he may have heard the footsteps of someone coming up Bucks Row, a possible worker on the way to his job. That doesn't bother Dr. Stanley because he is able to just slip away into the night. But he also had the alibi that if he got stopped, well, he's a doctor. He was heading off to attend to somebody. But now he's been able to hone down where this particular person he's looking for may have lived. And it's not in Whitechapel, but Spitalfields. But then, not long after, just a week or so later, he begins talking to Annie Chapman. He finds out that she knows a little bit more information. She believes she knows where that person he's looking for lives and is able to give a name. Kelly. Well, again, whilst that information was useful, he has to do something about this eyewitness. So going in to that back area in Hanbury Street, another dark, secluded spot, he's also able to do away with Annie Chapman, which is part of the feeling of quelling this desire for revenge. But this time we can see the anger is building up. And he does a more vicious crime than he did only about 8 or so days before. But now he is hatching this plot to find the person with the last name of Kelly and exactly where she is. Because he knows he cannot keep doing this attacks without being caught, without suspicion being raised on him. So it was a little time after he runs into Elizabeth Stride. And in fact, being quite bold now, he's done 2 attacks and got away with them. He goes up to the fruit cellar, even buys Elizabeth Stride grapes before they go into Dutfield's yard. But it was there that Elizabeth Stride no doubt gave him some extra information, pointed him into the direction of Dorset Street and Miller's Court. So now, fueled with this knowledge and this revenge starting to really build up in him, he knows he has to quickly do away with Elizabeth Stride. Very similar to the way he did with Polly Nichols. But now he's making a beeline back to that area where he knows his true victim lies. But by some absolute coincidental quirk, he runs into Catherine Eddowes, who had given her name Kelly at that police station before being released. And so now he, believing he has found the person that took the life of his son. So he plays along with the transaction. She takes him into a very dark, secluded spot of Mitre Square, and this is perfect. He seeks about exacting the revenge, doing atrocities to this poor woman that are indescribable. Mutilations to the face and other areas. But now he is complete. He's achieved what he set out to do, and off he goes home. But to his dismay, the following morning when he opens the newspapers, they're not reporting that this person was Mary Kelly. They're saying it's Catherine Eddowes. How could that be so wrong? Surely he had the right person. But the actual perpetrator of the crime is still out there. He needs to find that person. The rage, the anger, the thirst for revenge just keeps building. But he knows he cannot make this same mistake twice. And so he hits the streets, but doing things differently this time. Trying to find others who could definitely help him to achieve the result he needed. And he comes across a very shady character in desperate need of money. George Hutchinson. Now, he had been in the area, and it is suggested that perhaps he was more than just a friend to some of these women, but may have been some type of employer. But now Dr. Stanley says to him, I am looking for Mary Kelly. And George Hutchinson says, well, I can point her out, but what's the cost? He is given a large sum of money. He's told the night that he needs to have her around Miller's Court. Because when Dr. Stanley finds out that she has a room of her own, well, that's perfect for his intention. But the risk of being caught is high. So he pays that bit extra to make sure that when he gets into that room, George Hutchinson will act as a lookout. He will keep an eye to make sure that no one will interrupt this final act of revenge. So on that very night, when Mary Kelly is coming back to the room with Dr. Stanley, it's George Hutchinson who confirms he definitely has the right person, and then stands lookout outside Miller's Court. Dr. Stanley commits the most atrocious and horrific crime you could imagine. And seeing all the wounds and everything inflicted, this was him almost losing total control, exacting his vengeance in full. And he goes away, possibly feeling triumphant in that moment. But in the days that followed, or maybe even that very evening, he came across this very, very sad truth. Because people say vengeance is a dish best served cold. But in reality, it's a dish best not served at all. Because this vengeance didn't take away the pain. This vengeance didn't right the wrong that he believed had happened. But now he knew his life and career in London would be over. In fact, some of the police were starting to put two and two together and make inquiries of him. So Dr. Stanley flees the country and goes to South America. And sadly for him, he then actually contracts the very disease he had fought most of his life to fight. And catching cancer, he starts to deteriorate rapidly. But by coincidence, again, one of his students happened to be working over there, who was now a qualified doctor. And on his deathbed, well, he admits to doing all these crimes, and for the reason as to why he did it. He did not confess because it was getting a weight off his chest. Whilst the vengeance did not satisfy him, he felt happy that he had done it. And he'd want his family to know that he had fought for his family. And interestingly, George Hutchinson, when he heard that Dr. Stanley had fled the country, he had to go cover himself. He had to go and present to the police and say, I was actually keeping watch because I saw a very shady guy going into Miller's Court. And I wanted to confront them, but eventually I had to leave. But for whatever reason, the former student of Dr. Stanley, who Dr. Stanley confessed to, decides to tell a journalist. And then in South America, this got printed as the final solution to Jack the Ripper. Well, that's the story of Dr. Stanley. Now, I'm going to explain where this comes from, and also I probably don't have the story exactly right as it was first presented. But a bloke by the name of Leonard Matters, who was born in Adelaide, Australia in 1881, though it wasn't exactly Australia at the time as such, as we will cover shortly, but he wrote the book, The Mystery of Jack the Ripper. That book we will be talking about in quite some detail in this video. Now, I have not read that book, I have to state. In fact, it's a very hard book to come by because it was published like back in 1920s, late 1920s, And so if you got a copy of it, you hang on to it because they're worth quite a bit, as we're going to see. But it's important to discuss who Leonard Matters was. Now, he served in the Australian Army, and I find this title rather interesting because he was part of the South Australian Imperial Bushmen. Yes, the Bushmen. That's how some of the titles in the Australian Army were back in the day. And he's actually been minted on a coin during the Second Boer War. Someone took a picture of him sitting on a horse with a rifle in hand. And so in Australia, there's a coin, if you can find it, with his imprint on it. But oddly enough, he wasn't just a bit of a big deal in Australia. He actually was running for Parliament in England. And you might think, well, how can an Australian become an English member of Parliament? Well, Australia wasn't a federation until 1900. So if you were born before then, you were still a British citizen because Australia was just a colony. So it was still part of that empire. So he was able to go back to England and run for Parliament. And he was in the House of Commons during the late 1920s. Now, interestingly, this is when he also had his book out. And that, to me, is important. But Leonard Matters was not just a soldier, he was also a journalist, and he did write a couple of books. Now, when it first came out, this particular book, it got a little bit of a pasting, we might say. People said, this is just nonsense. But one particular crime writer from the United States, Edmund Pearson, said this about the book, The Mystery of Jack the Ripper. And I quote, "The deathbed confession bears about the same relation to the facts of criminology as the exploits of Peter Rabbit do to zoology." I mean, we might say Bugs Bunny today, but that's the point he's making. He's saying it's just totally wrong, it's fiction, you can't take it seriously. And that opinion has continued with many ripperologists today, saying this was just made up. But I will say this. See, yes, no, Dr. Stanley as such did not exist. That's fair to say. But the book was not written as fiction. And as will come out later, this book plays a big part in ripperology. But when he was writing the book, whilst what he was putting in there, he said, was well researched and full of facts, the actual person he used a pseudonym for. So he said, I'm not giving the real name of the suspect I'm discussing. Now, why? Why, if you're going to this much trouble and this much research, would you not name the name? Well, I could think of 3 reasons, maybe 4. Firstly, there could have been a legal threat against him. You publish that name, his publishers might have said, we can't do that. Come up with a made-up name for this bloke, because if this gets out, well, they'll have our house, our car, our boat, whatever we might own, our pens on our desk will go to somebody else because we will get sued. So just cover over the name. The other reason is Leonard himself might have thought, well, look, this bloke was so well respected and his family are still very prominent. Do I really want to smear this person? Because it won't do me any good. So he may not have cared too much about the real Dr. Stanley, but because he was seeking a life in the public profile, well, maybe he just knew that he didn't want to upset the wrong people, because that could end your career quickly. And then there's also the possibility it was just a total invention. But I'm not so sure about that as being a genuine reason. And I'll say this, for the reason that Leonard Matters was trying to get into politics. He was well known in journalism. So if he just came up with a totally ridiculous idea, would that not tarnish his reputation? Would people not think, well, you're just a bit of a nutter and we can't take seriously anything that you say? So what I'm suggesting is that it had to have some basis in fact somewhere. Now here's the kicker. I did some research on this particular Dr. Stanley, trying to find a prominent cancer surgeon, doctor, researcher, or someone even slightly related in those fields who had a similar story about a son passing away, and that sending this person off a downward spiral where he ended his career. I couldn't find one. Now, I have to state this. Yes, on the pub test, I've covered quite a lot of suspects. And some of these suspects, people have spent decades in researching one suspect. And they've got really, really good information. I don't have the time to spend a decade diving into the records, because those records are really, really hard to navigate, even if you can get your hands on them, and even if they still exist now. So the fact that I couldn't find it doesn't mean that it couldn't have happened. But I do find it interesting that in doing the research, and I'll just mention one particular thing, I'm not going to name the doctor so that you don't think I believe that this was the Dr. Stanley who was Jack the Ripper, whose husband died, and when they did the autopsy, they found his body full of chloroform. So his stomach was full of chloroform, which you don't ingest through the mouth, but they couldn't find any other way that he took it. And so she was on charge for murdering her husband. But her defense lawyer got her off by saying, look, the point is, old mate didn't scream. Now, if you drink the chloroform, that's going to burn your throat and you would be screaming. Nobody heard screaming, therefore, he may have just taken his own life. Now, that must have raised enough doubt in the jury, and they acquitted this woman. Now, she could no longer be tried. This particular doctor came out and said, hey, it'd be really, really, really good if she would now tell us how she managed to do it. How she could get that poison down this bloke's throat without him screaming. Because she can't get convicted anymore, but it certainly would help scientific research. Because what he's saying, and I don't see how this was missed at that particular court case, but if you were trying to take your own life by drinking it, you were still going to be screaming because it's burning your throat. And so he was saying, how could that have happened? So because they were so vocal, these doctors, in the media, it would take a very brave police officer to perhaps start accusing one of them, because their whole career could end very quickly, because the police certainly weren't as prominent as these surgeons and researchers and professors. Now, I have to state as well here, I mentioned George Hutchinson in there. I don't know if that's mentioned in the book at all. In fact, I doubt it. I haven't got my hands on a copy of that. I would like to read that book for other reasons as well, which I'm going to talk about. But I find that little detail of Hutchinson actually standing guard for the person committing the crime quite an interesting little rabbit hole to go down, because that makes more sense than a bloke standing out in the freezing cold watching a door. When you've already said you've got such a good description, you could basically photograph the bloke and you gave that detail to the police. Makes no sense, but the fact he might have been paid to stand out there makes more sense to me. Now, I have to say, though, this whole notion of someone seeking revenge and going around finding people involved in what you believed was an atrocity against your family, but I will say here, it's just totally wrong. It's the idea that some bloke goes off with some woman and then he gets a disease and you have to blame the woman is ridiculous. I mean, you know, like you play the game, you carry the trophy. I mean, why did not the doctor go to his son saying, you are mug, mate? I told you the types of things that can happen when you involve in that sort of activity. Now, I'm going to try and help you, but, you know, if you don't make it, that's on you. But no, we don't see that a lot in people, do we? It's not, personal responsibility goes out the window. It had to be someone else's fault. So revenge had to happen. And the way these crimes happened, the way I described it in telling the story, actually does make sense. They're coming across people, the slow ramping up of the attacks, right culminating with that absolute assault in Miller's Court. Well, to me, that passes the pub test if we accept that it was one person committing these crimes. It also explains the sudden stop in crimes between Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly, because that was a long gap. Even the police probably thought, well, it's over. But you could understand someone needing the time to plan this final act of revenge. Again, it sounds very, very plausible. And it also ties in well with what the police said. Remembering they said, well, look, we know these crimes have stopped, so we don't have the Jack the Ripper issue anymore. He's gone. Now, there were so many differing opinions by the police as to what that really meant, whether the person had passed away, whether he was locked up in an asylum, whether he was overseas. It really didn't matter, but they were shutting it down. But one comment of Sir Melville McNaughton still goes through my mind, and this would make the most amount of sense if this theory is true. When he said, "We know who's done it, but we're not releasing the name for the sake of the family." Now, the person he normally pointed to there was Montague Druitt, and he said it was him. But Druitt's family wasn't that prominent. But this surgeon, this cancer surgeon, well, his name might still be prominent today, if we can find out who he was. So definitely back then, you'd be keeping that under wraps. And that comment then all of a sudden, yeah, makes sense why he would say that. But why did McNaughton say, but the person's dead, rather than he's just fled the country? Probably to stop people digging. Because if he's passed away, no harm done now, is there? So we may as well just not worry about it. But if they're still alive, then people would be more interested. That's just how I see it. Now, does this pass the pub test? I think the story itself definitely does. I could see that being the way the crimes actually happened, particularly if it was one perpetrator. Yet, I just don't see it myself because of a couple of reasons. If there was this confession published in a South American newspaper, I feel it would have got a lot more traction worldwide. Because we know that Jack the Ripper stories were gaining a lot of attention around the world. But it seems it was very localized, this confession, and that seems odd to me. And identifying the doctor is proving so problematic. Now, if you've got research, let me know. Put it down in comments or send me a message. Like, I'm interested to know if there is someone that could match this description, but I just cannot find it. But as I said, this book, The Mystery of Jack the Ripper, is intriguing on its own merits. Why? Because it is said it started Ripperology. Yes, a suspect being mentioned in a book showing all the evidence was the first time this was done. Now, it wasn't written as fiction, as I stated, though other people have since written fiction books based around facts. Other people have done books similar to this. And people collect these books. And also, if you've got a copy of this book in your collection, let me know down in comments. I promise I won't beg to get my hands on it. Well, actually, no, I won't. And why, you might ask, do I want to read this book? Well, there's a little bit of detail in this book that you can't get anymore. It's gone. And that's the photos. Now, I'm not having a crack at the people who do those walks, the Jack the Ripper tours and all those sorts of things, and they do the walks around Whitechapel and showing where the crimes happened, because they themselves say, look, things have changed. Yeah, we can show you the areas where they happened, but you're not looking at what it looked like when the crimes were occurring. But in this book, there are photos of the crime scenes, or not, well, actually where the crimes occurred, I should say. And they look pretty well much the same as they did back then. And that bit of detail is now lost to history. And that's why if you can find this particular book, it's very hard to find, but they are worth a little bit of money, particularly to collectors. But what do you think? Do you think Dr. Stanley could be a credible suspect as Jack the Ripper, or was it just a very good work of fiction to sensationalize a story to get your name out there so you could get elected into the House of Commons? Because that's also a possibility. I'm sort of leaning towards that, but if someone could find that doctor, then could very see myself reconsidering that. But in 2 weeks' time, I'll be bringing out another Jack the Ripper video. And this one will be covering a lesser-known suspect, but it raises questions as to whether the Ripper crimes actually ceased. So look out for that one. But in between then, there'll be another video out on a different topic. So I'll be doing Jack the Ripper videos every second week from here on. But if you are new to the pub test, huge welcome. If you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for sticking around and watching. It greatly is appreciated. Thank you to all who are sharing the videos. And I've been told that YouTube like me saying, so like and subscribe. So I've done that. Thank you, YouTube. I'm Owen. You've been watching the pub test, and we will see you on the next one.